I'm going to tell you something that will make your blood run cold. A truth so vile it feels impossible. For 10 years of my life, the very person I sacrificed everything for, the boy I raised with every ounce of my soul, turned my home into a private torture chamber. He violated me, day in and day out, while I lay paralyzed and powerless, trapped inside my own body. He did this not as a stranger, but as my sole caregiver, wrapping his monstrosity in a perfect cloak of familial duty. This didn't happen in a dark alley. It happened right here in Charleston, South Carolina, beneath the roof where I dreamed of his success. My name is Eleanor Vance, and I'm 75 years old. The people who see me today, running my small but thriving herbal tea shop, Miss Ellie's Healing Brews, often tell me I have the kindest smile in the city. They know me as the gentle woman with a remedy for every ailment, a word of comfort for every worried mind. They see the calm, the peace, the quiet victory. They have no idea about the decade of hell I survived. For years, I kept this secret locked away, but silence is a cage, and I've decided to break free, hoping my story can be a key for someone else. Before the shop, before the tea, before the trauma, my life was a relentless cycle of hard work. I was a young single mother in Charleston's historic district, earning a meager living in a bustling clothing alteration shop. I spent my days hunched over a sewing machine, the whir and clack providing the soundtrack to my exhaustion. Caleb's father walked out the moment I told him I was pregnant. I was only 20, but I swore I would give my son Caleb everything I never had. I grew up with little affection, so I poured every fiber of my being into Caleb. I overcompensated, perhaps giving him too much love, too much slack, shielding him from every hardship. I worked double shifts, saved every tip, and made sure he had good clothes and a proud mother at every school event. I realize now that in trying to build him a perfect, protective world, I accidentally forged a tyrant. My excessive devotion convinced him that he owned a piece of me, that I existed solely to serve him. The idea that a sinister darkness was cultivating beneath that polite exterior never once crossed my mind. Caleb was a seemingly good boy. He was quiet, never got into trouble at school, and often helped me with chores at the shop and at home. He'd hug me tight, saying, "Mom, I'll take care of you when I grow up. You won't have to work this hard forever." Those words were the fuel that kept me going through the long, dusty hours. He was a passable student, respectful to teachers, a truly unremarkable boy in all the right ways. But when he turned 18, I started noticing subtle, unnerving shifts. It began with the way he looked at me. Not the adoring gaze of a child, but a slow, lingering stare, particularly when I was tired, dressing, or fresh from the bath. I felt eyes on me constantly, a sickening awareness that I was being watched. I'd brush it off, blaming my fatigue and telling myself I was becoming paranoid. The change in his eyes was just the beginning. Soon, the simple, affectionate touches of a son morphed into something else, something demanding and suffocating. You won't believe the lengths he went to justify his new, terrifying level of physical closeness. But you must stay to hear how the man I trusted most in the world systematically stripped me of my dignity, even before my body failed me. The uncomfortable looks soon transitioned into what felt like deliberate physical boundary violations. Caleb became overly affectionate, far beyond the norm for a mother and her adult son. He craved constant physical contact. Hugs that lasted too long, kisses on the cheek that lingered, and a persistent habit of leaning against me whenever we were near one another. I felt a deep, instinctive unease, a primal alarm bell ringing that I struggled to silence. If I was cooking in our tiny kitchen, he would sneak up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and pressing his body against mine. It wasn't the sweet hug of a young boy. It was a heavy, deliberate pressure that made my stomach churn. When I pulled away and asked what he was doing, he'd give that easy, innocent laugh. "Can't a son hug his own mother, Mom? You work too hard. I'm just showing you love." His words were designed to make me feel guilty for being suspicious, for reading evil where he claimed there was only care. One evening, he offered to give me a massage, claiming my shoulders were permanently tight from leaning over the sewing machine all day. I agreed, foolishly grateful for the gesture. His hands started correctly, working the tension out of my neck. But soon they began to stray, moving lower down my back, closer to my hips, and then gliding toward my chest, under the guise of relaxing my side muscles. When I gasped and firmly told him that was enough, he immediately withdrew, his face shifting from feigned concern to a flicker of cold anger. He laughed it off, accusing me of having a dirty mind and exaggerating, insisting he was only trying to relieve my stress and that I was seeing things that weren't there. This insidious pattern, the violation followed by the gaslighting, was his most potent weapon. He made me doubt my own sanity and perception of reality. His invasions of privacy became bolder. He stopped knocking on my bedroom door, barging in with flimsy excuses. He needed to ask about a bill, he was looking for a tool, or he just wanted to chat before I slept. Yet his eyes were always glued to me, especially if I was in my nightgown. He would deliberately prolong these visits, talking about nothing while his gaze roamed over my body. When I confronted him about this new, unsettling habit, he'd fly into a manufactured rage. He'd tell me I was paranoid, that the years of hard work were driving me mad, and that I needed more rest. He would say, "You need to stop seeing evil, Mom. I just want to talk to you." He twisted the situation until I felt I was the one who was wrong, the one who was sick for suspecting my own son. The fear reached a terrifying peak one night when he came home from a party, slightly drunk. He stumbled into my room, claiming he'd had a horrible nightmare and couldn't sleep alone. Against my better judgment, I let him lie on the edge of the bed, thinking he'd pass out. But in the darkness, I felt him shifting, pressing closer to me, his hands settling on my waist, and then moving to my leg. I woke up in a panic and asked him what he was doing, but he instantly went still, pretending to be in a deep, innocent sleep. The next morning, when I brought it up, he denied everything. He claimed I had dreamed it, that it was a realistic nightmare common in overtired people, advising me to take better care of myself. I started to be genuinely afraid of him, a fear I couldn't rationalize to anyone else. To the world, he was the attentive, loving son. I began avoiding him, locking my bedroom door for the first time in my life, and changing my clothes in the bathroom to avoid his eyes. I was taking precautions against my own child, and the shame and anxiety over this fact were nearly unbearable. I was trying to convince myself I was crazy, that my mind was playing tricks on me, when fate intervened. But fate is not always kind. My body was about to give out, and in the space between one breath and the next, I would go from a mother cautiously guarding her boundaries to a woman entirely at his mercy. What happened next would ensure that his control was absolute, and my living nightmare would truly begin. The day my life split into before and after was a humid, ordinary Thursday morning in April. I was exhausted, having worked a late night finishing a batch of complicated wedding gown alterations. I clocked out of the shop and started the familiar walk to my bus stop. I was focused on the list of chores I had for the evening, the heavy weight of work and worry pressing down on me. I remember stepping off the curb, ready to cross the street, when a searing, blinding pain exploded in the back of my head. It was as if a massive, invisible fist had slammed into my skull. My vision immediately tunneled and darkened. I felt the concrete sidewalk tilt beneath me, a sickening vertigo taking over. I tried to grab a nearby lamppost, but my left side was suddenly unresponsive, heavy and dead. I collapsed onto the hot pavement. My mind was still lucid enough to register the sound of a car screeching to a halt and a man shouting. But then, there was only darkness. I woke up days later in a hospital bed, surrounded by the sterile scent of antiseptic and the gentle beeping of machines. A kind-faced doctor explained that I had suffered a severe stroke, a cerebral hemorrhage. "The stress, the overwork, Mrs. Vance," he said gently. "It all contributed." The damage was significant. The entire left side of my body was paralyzed. I could move my right arm with difficulty, but my left arm and leg were inert, and my speech was slurred. I was completely dependent on others for everything: bathing, feeding, getting to the bathroom. The life I knew, the life of a hard-working, independent woman, was over. Caleb arrived at the hospital and immediately put on a show of heartbreaking devotion. Now 22, he sat by my bedside, holding my hand and weeping. "Mom, you dedicated your life to me," he choked out. "Now, I'm dedicating mine to you. I'm going to be your strength." I was deeply moved by what I took to be genuine love and sacrifice. I thought I had failed him by getting sick, but I was wrong. I had simply given him the opportunity he'd been waiting for. When I was discharged, a social worker arranged for a physical therapist and a home health aide named Doris, a competent, warm woman in her late 40s, to come 3 times a week. Doris was teaching me gentle exercises and helping me with basic hygiene. She was respectful and kind. But within 2 weeks, Caleb started the campaign to get rid of her. He began finding fault with everything Doris did. He accused her of being careless with my positioning, of not cleaning me properly, of hurting me during my PT. He twisted every necessary medical action into a sinister act of neglect. He complained so relentlessly to me and the agency that Doris, exhausted and intimidated, finally quit. I protested weakly, but Caleb was firm. "She's incompetent, Mom. No one will take care of you the way your own son can. I know exactly what you need." With Doris gone, the house became silent, and Caleb was in total control. The loving son facade had served its purpose. Now my dependency was his permission. The intimate care I needed quickly began to transform, under his hands, into something perverted and terrifying, proving that the subtle abuse I'd experienced before the stroke was merely a rehearsal for the real horror to come. How would he justify his truly monstrous acts? And what twisted logic would he use to silence a mother who could no longer speak clearly? The moment Caleb became my sole caretaker, the subtle shifts I had noticed before the stroke, the invasive looks, the inappropriate touches, exploded into a system of total, terrifying control. The baths I needed, which had taken Doris a gentle 10 minutes, began to stretch into grueling, hour-long rituals with Caleb. He insisted I was prone to bed sores and hidden infections due to my paralysis, claiming I accumulated dirt in places a regular person couldn't imagine. He argued he had researched meticulous hygiene for the bedridden, and that only his specialized, prolonged attention would suffice to keep me healthy. He manipulated me with medical language, making me believe that his disgusting behavior was a necessary act of life-saving care. When I would try to protest or tell him it was too much, he would become cold and authoritarian, saying, "You don't understand medicine, Mom. You're lucky I have the patience for this meticulous cleaning. If I don't do this, you could get a fatal infection." His words hammered home my complete reliance on him, eroding any willpower I had left to resist. His hands, once disguised as affectionate, were now openly invasive. During these protracted hygiene sessions, he would run his fingers over my breasts, claiming he was checking for nodules and poor circulation that could lead to cancer in paralyzed women. He would then move to my private area, inserting his fingers and manipulating me under the guise of cleaning secretions and checking for infection. The touches were deliberate, lingering, and sickeningly sexual, yet always cloaked in the clinical language of a devoted son. I felt a raw, desperate mix of disgust and sheer terror. I was completely trapped. My left side was lifeless. My right hand, weak from disuse and the stroke, had no strength to push him away. My attempts to speak were slurred and easily dismissed as the irrational ramblings of a traumatized, disabled woman. I was a prisoner in my own body, forced to watch and feel every violation without the power to scream or fight back. The desperation was a suffocating blanket. He soon controlled everything else in my life. He decided which medications I took, what food I ate, and which television channels I was allowed to watch. He dictated who I could see and what I could hear. He told me it was for my own good, asserting that as my primary caregiver, he had the final word on every decision related to my health and well-being. He enforced total isolation. When the kind old neighbors or anyone from the alteration shop came by, he'd answer the door with a weary, martyred sigh. He'd whisper that I was too weak, that the doctor had prescribed absolute, uninterrupted rest, or that I was simply sleeping off a painful episode. Slowly, one by one, everyone stopped visiting, convinced that the dedicated Caleb had my best interests at heart and that I was too ill to receive company. The walls of our small home became the boundaries of my prison. His abuse was no longer hidden in innuendo or suggestion. It became routine, a terrifying, explicit part of my daily existence, leading to the ultimate horror that a mother can face. The systematic isolation was perfect. Caleb had successfully created a world where he was a saint and I was his broken, grateful burden. But years into this living nightmare, a flicker of hope emerged, a faint, desperate plan formed in my mind. It would rely on the one person Caleb had successfully pushed away, and it would involve a code so subtle, so easy to miss, that only someone looking for it would ever see it. How could I reach out from my prison without him knowing? And would the one person I needed ever return to look for the sign? The abuse continued its relentless cycle, year after year. Caleb's confidence grew with every passing month of successful manipulation and isolation. He had achieved the perfect crime, violation cloaked as care, with no witnesses and a victim incapable of communicating the truth. It truly felt as though he had been waiting for my stroke, for my paralysis, so he could act on the dark obsession that had been festering inside him since he was a young man. I lived in a state of constant low-grade terror, interrupted by spikes of pure panic during his care sessions. One afternoon, desperate and frantic, I managed to inch the small bedside phone off the nightstand with my usable right hand. I dialed the emergency number, my heart hammering against my ribs. When the operator answered, I tried to speak, tried to scream for help, but the medication Caleb gave me, coupled with the residual slurring from the stroke, made my words unintelligible. I sounded like a confused, frightened child. The woman on the other end, unable to understand the garbled plea, suggested I needed to contact a non-emergency social worker and disconnected the line. Just moments later, Caleb walked into the room and saw the phone in my hand. His face hardened into a mask of pure, cold fury. He didn't raise his voice, which was even more terrifying. He snatched the phone away and fixed me with a stare that promised absolute punishment. He warned me that if I ever tried to call for help again, he would tie me to the bed permanently, convince any inquiring medical personnel that I was having psychotic outbursts due to the stroke, and have me heavily sedated. He said I would be utterly alone, reduced to a vegetable under his total care. The threat was terrifyingly believable, and the spark of resistance in me guttered and died. He also became incredibly meticulous about his public image. He started taking me to my rare medical appointments, always insisting on being present for every examination and conversation with the doctor. He'd paint a picture of himself as a weary, dedicated hero, saying, "I note down everything, doctor. Mrs. Vance can't speak clearly, but I can tell you exactly what's going on." The doctors, seeing his seemingly flawless devotion and hearing his articulate reports, praised him for his sacrifice. The neighbors, too, would stop him on the street to tell him he was an example of a son who had given up his life for his sick mother. He had created an impenetrable wall of respectability around his private cruelty. The years bled into one another. I lost hope. I had a few more failed attempts at resistance, mainly crying out in pain or distress, only to have him calmly dismiss it as a neurological symptom of my recovery. He used my weakness to bolster his own power. I believed I would die in that bed, trapped with the monster I had raised. But then I remembered Doris, the good-hearted aide he had fired so easily. She had mentioned, during one of her last therapy sessions, a subtle way for stroke victims to signal distress if they were ever in danger. A simple, deliberate pattern of blinks, based on an old code used in rehabilitation centers. I had dismissed it then, but now, it was the only piece of armor I had left. After all these years, the image of St. Caleb was unbreakable to the outside world. But what if one person, haunted by the memory of my sudden isolation, decided to defy his commands and come back? What if, on that chance return, I could remember the code and finally, silently, scream for help, risking the fulfillment of his terrible threat? The moment of truth arrived unexpectedly, almost 8 years into my private hell. I was lying in bed, staring blankly at the ceiling, when I heard a firm, unfamiliar voice at the door. Caleb was immediately on guard. I heard him answer the door, and the voice introduced herself, Doris, the former home health aide. She wasn't there by chance. She later confessed that she had been deeply troubled by Caleb's behavior and my sudden disappearance from the agency's registry. She had always felt uneasy about how quickly and aggressively he had dismissed her. Today, she had pretended to be an independent social services representative, conducting a mandatory follow-up on long-term stroke patients. A story she fabricated on the spot. Caleb couldn't risk refusing a social services visit. He let her in, his body language tense and controlling, never leaving my side. He maintained his role flawlessly, smiling sadly and saying, "Mother is stable, but her aphasia is still severe. She has good days and bad days. I manage everything." Doris, an experienced professional, noted the meticulous cleanliness of the room and the apparent care, but she also noticed my eyes, flat, terrified, and following Caleb's every movement. As Caleb turned briefly to retrieve a new medication list from the kitchen counter, Doris leaned in close to me. Her eyes asked the unspoken question. This was my one chance. I took a deep breath. With all the focus and strength I could muster, I performed the subtle distress signal she had taught me years ago. 3 slow, deliberate blinks, a pause, and then 2 quick ones. A silent DNGR in Morse code. Doris's eyes widened, a flicker of understanding passing between us. She immediately moved back, composing herself, and thanked Caleb for the update. "Everything seems to be in order, Mr. Vance. You are a truly devoted son. I will just make a quick call to my office to confirm the file details." She left quickly, her calm exterior a mask for the panic and confirmation she now carried. She drove straight to the police station. She reported everything. Her initial suspicions, Caleb's forced isolation, and the silent, encoded plea for help she had just witnessed. It was a massive gamble. Who would believe a simple blink from a stroke victim over the word of a publicly revered caretaker? But the police listened. They had a warrant within the hour. When they arrived, Caleb was furious, screaming about an illegal invasion of his privacy, insisting they were harassing a disabled, vulnerable woman. They ignored his protests. A female officer stayed with me while others searched the room. The physical evidence was minimal, but the doctors who examined me confirmed signs of prolonged sexual trauma, which Caleb, in his arrogance, had rationalized as necessary medical cleaning in his carefully kept journals. The journals themselves, recovered by police, contained meticulous, terrifying notes about my health, alongside veiled, self-congratulatory entries about his control. The combination of Doris's testimony, the medical report, and his own narcissistically detailed notes shattered his facade. Caleb Vance was arrested that day, never to return. He was later convicted on multiple counts of sexual assault and abuse, and given a very heavy prison sentence. The terror was over, but the road to recovery was just beginning. Being freed from my prison was one thing. Learning to live again, to trust a world that had abandoned me to a monster, was another challenge entirely. But I was no longer a victim. I was a survivor, and I was about to rebuild a life so beautiful and powerful that it would become the ultimate, sweetest revenge. The moment the police carried Caleb out, the silence in the house was immense. Not the dead silence of a tomb, but the deep, quiet peace of a battle won. I was immediately transferred to a specialized rehabilitation center in Columbia, South Carolina, a place where I would be safe, cared for, and treated with the respect I deserved. My recovery was long, painful, and deeply humbling. The physical therapists were patient, working tirelessly to coax life back into my paralyzed left side. The movement was agonizingly slow. First, a twitch in a finger, then the ability to slightly lift my foot, followed by the monumental task of relearning to walk with a cane. My speech therapist, bless her heart, spent months untangling the fear and the stroke damage, helping me form clear, coherent words again. The physical wounds healed, but the psychological ones were far deeper. I spent countless hours in trauma therapy, learning to separate the man who hurt me from the concept of a son, and learning to trust human touch again. After 2 long years, I was discharged. I decided I could never return to the house where the worst decade of my life was spent. With the small amount of savings I had left and the settlement from a successful civil suit against Caleb, I sold the property and bought a small shopfront in a vibrant part of Charleston. I didn't want to go back to the world of sewing. I needed something clean, something healing. I remembered my grandmother, who had taught me the old ways. The power of herbs, the comfort of a good tea, the peace found in nature. I opened Miss Ellie's Healing Brews. I started small, just a few jars of chamomile and peppermint, but the business flourished. People were drawn to my quiet strength and my gentle advice. My little shop became a sanctuary for others who were struggling, a place where I could transform my pain into a purpose. It was at the Charleston Farmers Market, where I often sold specialty blends, that I met Marcus. He was a retired history professor, kind, steady, and had the most respectful eyes I had ever seen. He bought a different tea every week and always stopped to talk, never pressing, never rushing. He helped me carry boxes, patiently waited for me to close the shop, and offered me his arm when we walked to a nearby cafe for dinner. Marcus was everything Caleb was not. Protective without being controlling, affectionate without being possessive, and above all, deeply respectful of my history, my boundaries, and my strength. We started a true, supportive romance, a beautiful connection based on mutual trust and genuine affection. He was a partner, not a warden. I finally learned that I deserved happiness, respect, and dignity. My life was a full, vibrant tapestry again. I had found peace, purpose, and love in my 70s. I felt triumphant. My story of overcoming was even featured in a local wellness magazine under the title, The Grand Dame of Green Tea, Transforming Trauma into Triumph, where they printed my photo surrounded by my beautiful, healing herbs. I had won. My revenge was this new, peaceful, and successful life. I never thought about Caleb again, or if I did, it was with the detached pity one reserves for a distant, defeated enemy. But then, one crisp autumn morning, a shadow fell across the threshold of my bright, successful shop, and I heard a familiar, tremulous voice call my name, asking for help. The man who had terrorized me for a decade had come back, but he was no longer the monster of my nightmares. It was a cold Thursday morning, and I was in my shop, organizing fresh jars of calming lavender buds. I was humming softly, totally at peace, when the bell over the door chimed. A trembling, weak voice called out, "Eleanor? Mom, please help me." I turned slowly, and my heart hammered against my ribs, but for the first time in years, it wasn't a hammer of fear. It was a drum of shock. Standing there was a figure that was almost unrecognizable. It was Caleb, but the strong, domineering man who had controlled my life was gone. In his place was a frail, stooped individual, leaning heavily on a cane, his movements jerky and uncontrolled. His face was thin, his eyes sunken, and his body was clearly failing him. He looked like he had aged 20 years in the nine since his conviction. He was suffering from the debilitating symptoms of severe Parkinson's disease. He could barely stand, his tremors were violent, and his voice was a weak, barely audible croak. He saw me and instantly burst into tears, tears of true desperation and self-pity, begging for forgiveness and care. "Mom," he pleaded, his voice cracking, "I know what I did was wrong. I know I hurt you, but I have no one else now. I'm living in a boarding house. I can't care for myself. The disease, it's taken everything. Please forgive me and help me." He was attempting the same emotional manipulation he had used my entire life, but this time, he had no power over me. My new assistant, seeing the commotion, discreetly slipped out, leaving us alone. I listened to his entire, pathetic monologue without interrupting, simply observing the irony of his situation. When he finished, I finally spoke, my voice calm, clear, and perfectly articulate, a voice he hadn't heard in 2 decades. "Caleb," I began, using his full name. "Do you remember what it was like to be dependent on someone? To be utterly helpless? To have to trust the person who is supposed to care for you?" His face went pale as he finally understood the path I was walking down. I continued, my voice steady. "Do you remember those 10 years? The deep cleaning? The meticulous examinations? Do you remember my helplessness, my tears, and how you told me to be grateful because you were taking care of me?" I reminded him of the threats, the isolation, and the way he broke me piece by piece. "You wanted total control, Caleb. You wanted me to be your helpless victim forever." He tried to interrupt, begging. I was sick. I regret it. But I cut him off, raising my right hand, the same hand that had feebly tried to reach the phone, to silence him. "Now the wheel has turned," I said. "You are dependent. You are weak. You are alone. And you have come to me, the person you tried to destroy, asking for the one thing you took from me, care, dignity, and compassion." I took a deep breath. "I forgive you, Caleb, for my own peace. But I will not help you. I have built a new life on the ruins of the one you destroyed. My forgiveness is a gift to myself, not a handout to you." I pointed to the door. "You were my cross to bear, and I survived it. Now you must bear your own." He stared at me, his lip trembling, a ruined man staring at the woman who refused to be ruined. He turned slowly, his trembling body a pathetic shadow of the monster he once was, and stumbled out of the door. I never saw him again. My name is Eleanor Vance. I am 75 years old, and I live here in Charleston. My story proves that you can transform trauma into purpose, and that the ultimate revenge is not finding a way to hurt those who hurt you, but finding a way to live well.